Hi everyone, I'm Larry Rye. I've been with Multiplay for coming up for 6 years, part of Unity's family for about 3 years now. I head up the solution architect team. So basically we look after pre-sales and post-sales throughout the whole customer journey from a technical perspective. Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Larry. So I have been working with Multiplay and Unity for maybe a slightly more extended period of time, about 9 years, I think in total now. I started in kind of LAN gaming, hosting LAN servers, LAN game servers, and I moved very quickly into hosting consumer servers for people to play in. So things like Minecraft and the original CS 1.6 and CSS, those kind of things. I've then moved my career kind of into the enterprise hosting, and really being on the receiving end of a pager for a large majority of AAA titles. And I've moved just recently into our global support team, really helping customers launch games. So my lens is now on how I help game developers launch their games. Brian, do you just want to give us a bit of an intro to you?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Brian Wing. I am the technical director at Psyonix, working on Rocket League right now. In previous incarnations, let's see, I started out in game networking. I guess the first specifically game networking thing was I was one of the early founders of GameSpy, where we built kind of online SDKs for a lot of games in the industry to do matchmaking, lobbying, chat, all kinds of stuff like that. After that, I went on to, I was the second server engineer on World of Warcraft, hired by the first server engineer after he had not slept for 5 years. So there was a lot of exciting things that happened on WoW. I went on to work on a number of other MMOs, both released and unreleased, and now on to Psyonix.
Amazing. Definitely want to touch base on your GameSpy and WoW stories at some point today, because that sounds awesome. Joe, do you want to give us a quick intro to you?
Sure thing. I'm Joe Morton. I'm a programmer on the networking team at Valence Studios. So most recently worked on Knockout City, did a little bit of work on Mario Kart Live, home circuit. I started off with an internship back in Dublin, Ireland, where I'm from, at Demonware, when they had just been acquired by Activision, and I was shipped off to Vicarious Visions, where I worked on Guitar Hero ports, then eventually worked on the Skylanders franchise, Swap Force, and Superchargers. So yeah, that's me.
Fred Gill, head of technology for Respawn Entertainment. I've been in the games industry 37 years, so feeling old at this point. I had my own company out of university and joined Electronic Arts in the studios in 2004, working on Battlefield Modern Combat with DICE out of the Northwest studio. Left in 2006, but was enticed back in 2008 to a little group called EA Partners. We worked with external developers to bring their titles to market with EA as a publisher. Crisis 2, Crisis 3, Syndicate, Unravel, Unravel 2, A Way Out, Titanfall 1 and Titanfall 2 were all titles that I worked on at EA Partners, and first met Multiplay through Crisis 2, actually in the Rank Server program back in 2010, 2011.
I love the way you purposefully chose not to mention Apex there, Fred. Was that a design decision, or?
No, I forgot.
What?
Hopefully everybody knows we're responsible for Apex. I could add it back in if you want.
No, it's all good. I just wondered if you purposefully were like being a bit more like subtle about, yeah, I don't want to show off,
No, completely forgot. I was trying to go through the history. I'm not trying to block it from my mind. I forgot Jedi Fallen Order as well.
Yep.
Yeah, and some of you did BF2 as well with us, didn't you? And all the expansions therein and various other bits and pieces. I seem to remember.
No,
you didn't do BF2.
No, that was DICE.
Oh, okay, fine.
No,
okay.
Didn't get involved in that. No, forgot Apex and Jedi Fallen Order. That's bad.
Yeah, Fallen Order was quite a big one as well.
Reportedly, yeah. Not in the server market, given it was an offline single player game, but yeah.
No, exactly, yeah.
Oh gosh, never mind. I will drop them into the conversation later.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll be very surprised if we can get through an hour without talking slightly about Apex, Fred.
I was just going to say, there's other congratulations, because I believe that Wieland just had a TGS award, didn't you, from for Mario Kart?
Cool.
Or the Mario Kart live circuit.
Yeah, we just
Home circuit,
just saw that on our Slack actually over the weekend. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, congratulations. It was phenomenal. I played with it. My dog tried to destroy it. It was great.
Excellent.
Awesome. Have we got you now, Jahani?
Hey, I'm Jahani. I'm from France. I currently live in Czech Republic. I work in Bohemia Interactive, and I currently work on Vigor. It's a free-to-play game, looter shooter on consoles. So we are on PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch. No PC.
Amazing. Thanks very much.
Okay. Maybe I can talk. Yeah, I have 6 years of experience making video games. I started in Ubisoft in Paris. I was working on a small mobile game called Rabbids Heroes. It was a cat game on mobile. We never passed the soft launch, so it's not well known. And then I was working on Just Dance, which you might know if you have small girls in your house.
Or me, and I'm the big guy that doesn't look like he should be playing dance games, but I definitely do.
Good for you. It's a cool game.
I only ever embarrassed myself on dance games at the arcade.
Oh, in public, yeah, good for you.
Why not?
From the perspective of our first question, as you can see on the screen, there is, how do you prepare for a multiplayer game launch? And that can be all of everything to do with people management up to design decisions, all of those things leading to how you do the scalability from the server side perspective.
The short answer that pops to mind is to ask Fred for advice. Whenever I mean, at Activision, you know, it was always like, well, what does Call of Duty do? What does Call of Duty do? And now it's like making a game with EA. It was like, what did Apex do? What did Apex do? It's always, you always want to make sure that you don't make a mistake that somebody else knew what to do.
I'll answer then. EA has quite a rigorous process that it's developed over the years called QSPR, Quad SPR. That's 4 S's and then P and R. They're about scalability, resilience, etc. I won't go too heavily into the details, but there's a program where we work closely with EA's central teams on load testing, scale testing, checking how long servers, stability, how long servers can run for stably. It's months before a game launch. And then we have a lighter version of that for live service games. In Apex, we're releasing a patch every 6 weeks with a mid-season and a season every 3 months. So we are still building out the processes to make that more robust. But we test, how much memory do servers consume over a 24-hour period. And with Multiplay, we have tools that help us understand that. The same, does CPU use increase over time? Does it degrade, performance degrade over time? So there's a whole series of gates we go through, and we check and recheck. We see how our servers and infrastructure works with third-party services like Sony and Microsoft and EADP, EA's digital platform, to make sure that we don't have bugs in our code that are driving them at 10 times the rate that they should be, and that might bring EA down. I've certainly had horror stories, although they were entertaining at the time, from Slothy, who was a founding member of Respawn Entertainment and kind of grandfather of Strider, which is the system that Titanfall 1 and Titanfall 2 and Apex uses, around him bringing down various first-party services when he was at Activision or at Infinity Ward working on Call of Duty.
I think I remember that story at the time.
Yes, Microsoft certainly do. So I remember bringing down a first party on Crysis 3 and getting an emergency patch through in 2 hours for something where we introduced a bug and we were making calls at something like 10 times the rate we should have been to a key service, and we were going to bring down a first party. With the way it was a simple thing, just the way we were pinging to find out the best servers to be playing on, something that should have been parallelized, was serial and implemented in a poor way, can take down third-party services quite trivially. So we do as much testing as we can. You always have to remember, as good as our testing can be, and us, the black box, white box testing we do can be, we're never able to play the game or interact with other players the way that the public does. So it's only ever an approximation of what's really going to happen in the real world. So
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest piece of kind of advice I could give for multiplayer launching is you can do all of this kind of preparation and load testing, and there's a lot of very like mature learning at this point about how to do that kind of load testing. But I think the most valuable thing that I do to prepare is preparing the people on my team and at my studio for the unexpected, because there's a lot of things that you can really figure out when you're launching something that's single player or even like minimal multiplayer. But as soon as you get to large scale multiplayer, your players are probably the most important and unpredictable thing that's going to happen. And no matter what things you thought you were going to load test, your players are going to find that one table in your database that your load testing didn't actually cover. They're going to find it. They're going to find some way, and it's going to explode. And that also goes for our teams, right? Like most of us are going to, regardless of what we try to do in our industry, there's going to be a lot of work leading up to a launch, and people are going to be working very hard. And it's incredibly important to make sure that your backend team and your server team get sleep and spend time with their families before that happens. Because most of your studio is going to be working really hard right up into the launch, but your server team, their job really starts when the launch occurs. And there's not a lot of structure built into most studios' schedules for that to happen. And so as leaders who understand multiplayer, it's really important for us to tell everyone, our production teams, our leaders, hey, you need to make space for these people who are going to have to work 24/7 after the launch on unexpected things that no one thought of.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I would always say to a studio that we were talking to, is that it's preparing for the unknown. So it's very similar to what you're saying there, Brian. It's like, how do you literally prepare for those pieces? And I think no matter how many checklists you have or how many people you try and bring together from a stakeholder perspective, you always have those unknowns that are going to crop up on launch day. Are they going to create a fire, or are you going to be able to mitigate them with your planning? That's why I particularly like this question, because of trying to understand what things can be planned for. Some studios have some ideas, some studios have another ideas, some service providers have other ideas of their own. But it's how do we kind of coalesce that as best as possible so that we can remove some of those unpredictable parts of a launch. Joe, Fred, Johanny, Brian, is there any other points on this question that you guys want to jump in with?
One of the things that we did, and I know that other folks do it as well, is that we try our best to make sure that we can turn off everything at some granularity, or to tune it at some granularity. So if you're paging the database at some number, then put that number on a tunable so you can change it. Every WebSocket mesh handler that the backend has, each one of them can be turned off individually. And it's like there's no expectation that QA or we have to go through and test every configuration of those. It's your get out of jail free card. It's like, this thing is really bad right now, and if we just turn that off, that feature won't work. And there might be some other unforeseen side effects of it, but it allows you to then keep the thing afloat while you work on an actual solution.
Yeah, we have a lot of kill switches and tunables in Apex for exactly that reason. We're testing one at the moment in case we have to turn it off, a feature we have to turn off for security reasons. which I won't go into. But we have QA run passes and test those extensively before we ship, just to make sure that we have that control, because the unknown unknowns will be the thing that hit you. I think the other thing is you can design a little bit more carefully. So an example of that is we use an internal EA system called Marketplace as the backend for our store in Apex. If we have trouble connecting to the store, it locks you out of purchasing, and it will lock out certain combinations of legends, but it won't stop the game from running. So the service, try and design the service so it can degrade gracefully in case of problems. So it's not always possible, but usually you can flip things around in the way you think about them, so that they degrade more gracefully, and try and build that in where possible. But kill switches is the big one. Just be prepared to turn features off wholesale.
Degrading gracefully is degrading gracefully is an interesting one, because I find that the mindset for the networking team can be different. The mindset of folks working on gameplay. So what one person might think, like, this is essential, you have to have your character customization before you enter. It's like, well, maybe you wait for 30 seconds, and if you don't get it, maybe the player would rather just play a game and then have to wait, then not get in at all, or whatever.
I'm not sure how many of you were playing World of Warcraft when it first launched, but our load testing assumed that people would create a character, and then they'd click that character and they'd go in and they'd play. And there was a lot of testing of that particular path. But what we found out was that people created many characters right as they got the game to reserve all of their names, and then they spent time clicking between them to look at like all of their different faces and stuff. And every time you clicked between a character, it would load their clothes from the database. And so we had hundreds of thousands of people clicking between their characters rapidly and loading clothes from the database. And it brought the whole database down, of course. And for the first, I think, maybe week of World of Warcraft, most characters loaded in their underwear, because we had to quickly switch off the ability to load clothes from the character select screen. So yes, make everything tunable.
Yeah, I was going to say, but also a phenomenal thing of feature swipe turn off, right? Okay, cool. Now we can continue even though all of our player characters are naked. That's kind of awesome. Johanny, I saw you on mute there. Did you have something you wanted to add in?
Yeah. On Just Dance, we were doing just that. Like when we were running our load test, we implemented something called the circuit breaker on some of the systems, so that if they would become too intense and generate too much queries to the database, they would turn themselves off on their own, which was actually a really good thing to do. For instance, the leaderboards were very expensive because we had a NoSQL database, which is very slow to make leaderboard queries and sorting and ordering. And so, just switching off that single system at key points during the spike of players, was letting us welcome double the amount of players, basically. So we are going from a certain amount of CCU to the double amount of that on just the same infrastructures and database. So that's a graceful, how you call it? Yeah, graceful.
Degradation of service, I think.
Yeah, it's graceful degradation.
Yeah, circuit breaker was a good way of talking about that. So typically when I think circuit breaker, or when we talk to devs, that's a thing that a button a developer can push to turn it off. But it sounds like maybe in Just Dance that was almost an automated thing. Was that like based off of a number of requests or something like that? Or was that a thing that a developer pushed in the back end?
The way it worked was that if the response time from the database would go too high, like a certain threshold, some query, like we would just shut down that type of queries, like leaderboard queries from being sent to the database. We would wait for some time. And then at some point, we would let some requests go in. And if those requests had a healthy response time, we would just let all of them in. And if not, we would just keep the circuit breaker tripped so that no queries would go to the database.
Oh, nice. So it's kind of like, almost like live, almost rate limiting for your internal services, right? But with a circuit breaker that kind of performed off the front of that. Oh, that's very cool. Sorry, Larry, you go ahead.
I was going to say it's an interesting thing because of graceful degradation is certainly one way to address this. Thinking about like what we've done with most of you on the call actually is like scaling testing and things like that before. So we're trying to understand the full end-to-end communication flow. Is that something that you think is truly valuable in like understanding where those potential bottlenecks could be prior to launch? I know you can only do it in a synthetic manner, but do you find that valuable, or is that something that you think should not be required and is handled by these sort of circuit breaker type technologies or threshold based mechanics?
It's tricky because you cannot implement it from the get-go for everything. You need to gauge like what system will have an impact, because you can implement it on many systems and it won't have an impact, or it will never be used. So that's like kind of wasted energy or wasted potential for the team. For Just Dance, it was easier because we had a lot of legacy data, so we knew what system, what services were queried a lot, and based on the live data and the usual behavior of players, we designed our load test thanks to that, and so they were like really strong. But it's because it's a franchise, and so like every year we were adding more services and such, so we could like guess pretty precisely what the load would look like. It's also something you can do on live games because you have the history of the previous updates you've done.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, one thing that Brian said at the beginning is that actually you might know some of your internal kind of dependencies. And if you're a live game, right, you know what thick kind of queries is coming in. But actually one of the difficult things is kind of knowing what your interdependencies are, right? What are the things you're calling out on the internet? So are you reliant on Steam, or are you reliant on this service out here? How do you guys kind of test and deal with those kind of problems pre-launch when you know it's not even a service that you run, right? But you're relying on it quite heavily.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is that some third-party services or even first-party services will have a load test endpoint, so you can hit that. Yeah. But then other ones you'll ask for it, and they'll say, "Oh, there is none," and it's like, don't hit the dev one during load test, and don't hit the prod one, and you pretty much just don't load test it.
You just try to work with your platform partners, and hope that they have some robust testing. If they don't, pressure them to test at scale before your launch. But again, sometimes it's a black box, and you just have to be ready again to prepare them for your launch day.
And then, if you have stats that tell you the exact error codes that you're getting back, you can start to see then, like, so we'll meet every week and we'll look at all of the warnings and things like that on our back end, and we'll see different error codes, and we'll look them up for whatever the library was that we're calling out to, and we'll find out what the error code is, and we're like, oh, we're actually hitting a rate limit with this someone else's service, and they're handling it gracefully, and we'll only find out it's something that's not critical, and like end users wouldn't really notice it. We only find that out by actually going and inspecting after launch.
Yeah, so from that perspective, observability within first and third party sort of APIs or whatever the facility you're using is critically important for what you guys need to debug those type of situations before launch.
I think one thing we've kind of seen in the past when you're calling these third-party APIs or even first-party APIs, as you said, is that you might be getting a graceful response back, but maybe your own code isn't handling that gracefully and like either erroring out or problems or issues. Do you find that that's quite a difficult thing to kind of test or write code for pre-launch when you're kind of like, hey, the provider could give us all of these different libraries and they may not have an SDK or they may not have a proper interface and we're not handling those correctly? Is that a thing you come across many issues there?
I would say Joe is nodding in contemplation. It's like so many things here that I could say. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, we launched so recently, so it's just I'm just getting all the things are flying. No, it's just sometimes there are differences. So specifically on the client, there are differences when you run the game client in development versus in the retail environment, and you're not able to test the game client in the retail environment. So and certain things with the first party stores or various things like that, where your game can behave in a way that it just never saw in development or it never saw in certification, and it happened to happen in retail. And yes, I think that's sort of just what happens, and sometimes you have to just work with it when it happens.
I think the other thing there is getting all of the engineers to be used to async programming and asynchronous code. So the code, your game code's got to be able to handle responses taking 2 or 3 seconds to come back, and either fail gracefully or shut down the system. Again, the store in Apex, if it's not getting responses in a few seconds, the client will lock it out for a while. So it's not making those kind of calls, and then getting everybody to understand that model of programming can be difficult in a large engineering team, because it's not something that they're necessarily used to when writing a game.
And then I suppose the additional challenge comes in there is, when do I check again, and how frequently do I check again to unlock that feature back from the client side perspective?
Yeah, having exponential backoffs on things. So if you don't, then you can get a problem where every client, a few 100,000 clients, are hitting a service at exactly the same time. So again, building those kind of systems in from the ground up to help protect the engineers from themselves is a good process.
Yeah, the sort of age-old thing of like, try to not have the UI button press send a network request. I mean, like, it might sound silly, but it's like, yeah, sure, you could do it once, and maybe if you push the button again and it's been less than a certain amount of time, you don't do it again. Yeah, folks are nodding. It's like that method of programming has been around for quite a while, and it's just the most obvious thing to type when you're making UI or you're writing gameplay code. It's like, yeah, push the button and do the thing.
That's the easy thing to do, right? I had some troubles on Vigor also with that, like teaching the gameplay team, the scripters, the UI programmers to just implement things in a way that if the service would go down, it would gracefully be handled in the game. And we have a few of our systems that you can just log into the game, and if they're down, it's perfectly fine. You can play the game just right. Some things are unavailable, but yeah, you can play the game, which is the most important thing anyway.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One thing we've seen, or I've seen many times over years of launching games, is this idea of the stampeding herd, right? We have some sort of service that the client is reliant on that goes down, and then suddenly it comes back, and then the service kills over again because many multiples of thousands of people are trying to connect back to the service, and it can't quite keep up with the herd load. And then it becomes, your kill switches and your rate limits and all that kind of stuff to kind of ease the trafficking gracefully so that the service doesn't fall over, where you're kind of easing that back in. Has anyone kind of struggled with that on launching multiplayer titles?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I think that, the whole idea of having to do rolling restarts on a large MMO is based on that idea that you can't just restart your entire universe at once when you have hundreds of thousands of people connected. You're going to need to reboot pieces of it one by one and let them come back up. And a lot of my experience on large MMOs was kind of before the cloud world existed, and so a lot of that had to be done very manually. I think that if I were to design an MMO from scratch right now, I think it could be done a lot more automated. But like, as in my premise earlier, like whatever you think your bottleneck is going to be, it's probably something you didn't think of. It's going to be that one thing you didn't make a feature switch on that you need to have a feature switch on. Just expect that.
Yeah, just remember to cache the DNS resolution. I think it happens for everybody to blow up the DNS, right? The domain name server.
It's like basic sysadmin 101, isn't it? It's like however complex you're getting, it's always DNS. It's always DNS.
What is the one launch day challenge that you've encountered that made you want to tear your hair out?
Discovering that one system wasn't scalable. That was quite a bad one. But yeah, when we launched the Figure on PlayStation last year, we overlooked that one service the matchmaking service wasn't scalable actually. So we encountered issue where the whole process was no longer able to cope with the amount of matchmaking requests we were receiving. So yeah, we had to recompile the server with more C++ optimization. We had to beef up the single machine that was providing the service. But yeah, that was a very nasty surprise left by the former team.
Anyone else got a launch day horror story?
Oh boy. Well, let's see. Again, World of Warcraft has a lot of really great stories. We had a event that launched where in two of our kind of areas on the continent, these dwarves every 30 minutes would kind of drill up through the ground and try to spoil this party. And you'd have to kind of go to these barmaids and get these jugs of ale and chuck it at the dwarves. And if you did that, you'd get a point. And if you got enough points, you'd get a very, very uncommon mount. And this was before we really understood the way that the dynamics of design and the dynamics of what our players would do and how those would interplay to bring our services down. But we were all kind of like sitting there in the morning that it launched, and our NetOps people came in and they said, something's happening on our servers every 30 minutes, and we don't know what it is, but our bandwidth just goes through the roof, and we're about to hit our caps, and it's going to cost us millions of dollars if we hit that cap. So whatever there must be a cron job somewhere. And we're walking through the hall and talking about it, and one of my server engineers says like, hey, I know what it is. And again, the server engineers were not told about this event because it was all in design stuff. And he's like, I know what it is. And we're like, what is it? And he's like, oh, I'm doing it too. We have a stopwatch every 30 minutes. You log out, and then you log in right where the dwarves are. And then you run this macro to throw as many mugs as you can at these dwarves so you can get the point. And we're like, what? No, stop doing that. He's like, no, everybody's doing it. So
I was doing that. I wanted that brief rest mount.
Yeah.
You're part of the problem, Larry.
Normally.
But again, it's always really interesting to find out the ways that your designs are going to kind of combine with your technical abilities of your system and expose something that you didn't really prepare for.
Awesome. Any last launch day horror stories before we move on to our next question?
I might as well contribute one. So season 9 of Apex launch, we had a rocky launch because we had what's called a protocol version clash. So our season 8.1 point something or other network protocol version was the same as season 9's launch protocol version number, and because those go through first party, we found out the Thursday before the ship on the Tuesday, so we couldn't do anything with the first parties other than delay the launch. And because of our seasons, if we delay the launch and battle passes, people get frustrated because players have worked to those. So it's understandably they get frustrated. So we had to drain everybody out of our servers. We normally do 0 downtime, so people just transition transparently to new servers. But we had to drain everybody out and put everybody back in with the new servers. And it created a load on our authentication systems that we didn't have a kill switch for. Or we have a very crude kill switch for. And so it wasn't smooth at all. So we've changed our processes internally to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future. That's a human error that needs to be turned into a tool.
And actually, funnily enough, I hear this a lot, especially to Fred's point there, is it's the human component that you can't really guess about. Some people will just change things or implement something without knowledge of the bigger picture. And I think that's where you have to have that very tight cross-functional or interdepartmental sort of knowledge transfer happening to make sure that everyone fully understands, like, if I do this, this is the X and Y knock-on effect that comes from that change. And I think that's another one of those unknown unknowns that's not a player-driven behavior, it's an internal behavior.
It's easy to say that, Larry, in terms of games and systems that support them nowadays are massive. Yeah. And so it's not always some change that you think is innocuous and several people might sign off on it and think it's innocuous can have a devastating effect. So it comes down to how much testing you can reasonably do before you have to ship something to the public. And it's never as much time as we'd like, but as we've said previously, it's never perfect anyway.
No, and especially as we're now in the more game as a service model for a lot of the games that we look at, especially the live ones. There's no more like press your disc or burn your cartridge and send it to, it's not a ship and forget type thing anymore. It has to be an evolving service to make sure that people can play and keep enjoying them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one thing we've seen a lot of, or we have seen in the past, is, if a new build gets rolled out by a game developer and it has even, 1 megahertz extra CPU usage per player, and then you times that by, 10, 50, 100 players per machine, and you times that by thousands of machines across the globe, suddenly you have a really big problem in terms of extra CPU usage you weren't expecting, when really like a developer would look at a thing, I'm within 1 megahertz, right? It's absolutely nothing, no change at all. But actually, when these things start to scale up, you can have some serious problems quite quickly.
So at what point in the development lifecycle do you start making multiplayer technology choices? Is it right at the beginning? Is it, as we've seen, I would say this is depending upon segmentation. We do see quite a few studios go, oh crap, we need servers for this game. And then they start speaking to providers like within the last 2 months. What's your guys' feeling on this?
Well, these days, I think it is a very different world. Like I suspect that I'd be very surprised if a game that was expecting to ship multiplayer didn't start thinking about it pretty early. And the idea of like, we need servers is hopefully pretty rare these days, but it was extraordinarily common back in the early GameSpy days that we would get calls from companies and say, okay, we're shipping in a couple months and we hear you have a multiplayer SDK. Can we license that and put it in our game? And we just have to say, what? No, like you can't just compile in a multiplayer library a couple of months before you ship and expect your game to work. And they're like, what do we have to do? And we ended up actually spinning up a consulting business at GameSpy that was not very well advertised, but like it was essentially whenever a developer would call us asking to license our SDK and they didn't have any multiplayer, we'd send engineers out to them to try to help them get multiplayer into their games with better or worse success, depending upon how much they'd thought about it. To think, we had many entirely single player games with no idea of separating client and server or any sort of like, game loop like distribution. And they'd say like, can we put multiplayer? And be like, no, man, you got to rewrite. It's not going to work. So at what point, the earliest, like, I think in many games today, I would expect people to be building the multiplayer framework before most of the gameplay is even in.
Yeah, I've definitely gone through that pain of working on a single player local co-op game, and it's like, okay, we want to add online co-op, and it's just like, all right, this is going to be the next couple of years of my life now, because it's just, it's, you understand why you want to add it, but you have this team that's just like a train, going.
It's always a heartbreaking thing to have to tell someone that like their in the structure and architecture of their game is not going to work for multiplayer, and it's going to require a ton of work. But it definitely used to happen a lot. Yeah.
So our designers at the time would make their level, and at the time it was actually difficult because they would play it in single player and they would be like, oh yeah, everything works. And then you would say, hey, what about local co-op? And they're like, oh yeah, right, forgot about that. And they're like, okay, let me just test that. And then you have to be like, okay, now online co-op. And they're like, oh. And so, yeah, definitely working on Knockout City, working on Viper, the engine that we wrote for that from the ground up. It was like day one was like, okay, there's no mistakes here. This is going to be online from the get-go, which is an awesome place to be in as a network programmer.
Agreed. It's got to be as early as possible. I worked with a developer once that wasn't building out their multiplayer from day one. This is part of EA Partners. We advised them that they should be building and testing network play on a daily basis, because if they didn't, they were going to be in a world of pain later. And they had to basically stop engineering for 4 months later on in the project to get the end, to bring up the multiplayer to where it needed to be. And if they built it into their practices from day one, there'd have been attacks on the team because they're maintaining the system, but it would have been a lot quicker than the 4-month stall that happened.
You talk about practices there, Fred, and in my head that is bigger than just the code, right? You said about doing play tests and that kind of stuff. Is there particular things that you look for in your excuse me, in your teams with regards to how you're testing that on you're iterating on that multiplayer stuff? So is that like regular play tests? Is it like, constantly thinking about network first, or how does that work in the studio?
Respawn has been heavily focused on multiplayer since Titanfall 1, which was multiplayer only. So the team, I think not to generalize too much, but in the teams that I've seen that excel at multiplayer, it's part of the culture to play the game in the team as regularly as possible, not just rely on QA to do that. And we gather feedback from all of our devs that play on a daily basis, and they get to feed back into bugs quickly, and then things get fixed and iterated on really, really quickly. So I think multiplayer first mentality. If I look at the relative amount of testing we needed to do for something like Jedi Fallen Order versus Apex when we launched, it's a drop in the ocean, the cost for a single player story-based campaign. The complexities when you've got 60 people all interacting with each other on server performance, suddenly 20 people all decide to congregate together and not shoot each other, or 60 people, 20 Bangalores all in one place let off their ultimates at the same time.
Oh boy, yeah.
We can't possibly test for every combination of every player versus, or every legend versus every other legend. It's exponential in terms of the testing. We do as much automated as we can, and we're getting better at doing the automated testing. But what that doesn't allow us to have a smaller QA team. What that means is the QA team can actually look at quality, not at, can I get off the map? Can I create pathological circumstances where the servers can't cope? We can automate a lot of that, and that allows the quality QA team to say, is this new legend any good? Do I like the ultimates? Do I like their guns? Do I like what they're bringing to the game, and how do they interact with the other legends? So that's kind of the test your own game, dog food your own game as much as you can. If you're not enjoying playing it yourself, why would the public?
Absolutely. I think that talking about the timeline for multiplayer, the earliest point where you can get real players connecting from actual network locations that are distributed around the world, the better. We have to do a lot of load testing internally, but it's very important for everyone to know that whatever your load testing telling you is, it's a laboratory result, right? And your game is not going to be released in a laboratory. And the quicker you can get real players making real network connections, the better. It's and kind of piling on to what Fred was saying, the idea that people are going to gather together and do something taxing on your system is almost like a rule, a law. The more people in an area of interest, of network area of interest, the more things they're going to want to do. And right now you go into Final Fantasy 14 and some of the areas, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of people setting off as many cool effects as they can, because of course you have a giant audience to see all of your cool effects. And that leads to some fun.
It makes me think of when we discussed before, Brian, about the bunnies at the gates of AQ. This is exactly what it makes me think about. It's like you can't predict what people are going to do inside your creation. You've got some idea, but you can never really fully understand what, once you've unleashed this experience on the world, how people are going to interact with it and how they choose to consume it.
Yeah, it's a long story, but if you Google the original openings of the gates of Ahn'Qiraj in World of Warcraft, it was so many people gathered in the same area that our server would tick, roughly every 400 milliseconds, and we had a deadlock thread in there that was checking to make sure that it kept ticking, and it would deadlock after a tick took 20 seconds. It would say, well, the server must be dead. So many people gathered in one area that the server started ticking so slowly that it thought it had deadlocked, but it didn't deadlock. And I'm very proud of that, but it did definitely go down.
I wanted to build on one of the other points you made there, Brian, as well, and offer it up to the rest of the crew. I know Fred had to drop off, but one of the things that you mentioned, which was around bringing real players in as soon as possible, so we're not building it in this sort of silo. Quite a few conversations that I've had over the years is when people test LAN first, and they're very reluctant to make that jump into like internet play. What are people's feelings on that from a technology choice, and when you should phase that in?
Yeah, so again, going back to the topic of like when you make a multiplayer only game, it's awesome because there's nowhere to hide. Like you have to play the game with other people, you have to dogfood it, you have to experience it, which is fantastic. But you have to account for the fact that people are sitting on a LAN with no latency. So yeah, when you boot the game up in development, you spin up a local server, and we have simulated lag and latency and packet loss, and that's always there, so that players can really understand, testers, or not just testers, but testers and developers can really sort of understand that things are not just instantaneous. And then it gets a little bit more tricky, ironically, then when we start to then do play tests against real servers, because everybody in the studio is at the same location. We have a dev server that's 15 milliseconds away, and then we would, it's still not representative then, because it's like to get a more representative test, it's like, okay, let's all play a game in a different location.
There's kind of a corollary to that as well that I think speaks to server providers like Multiplay and i3D, and cloud providers like Google and Amazon, which is that in the early days, even when we're testing on real servers, we'll tend to load test on one machine, because the machines are so beefy these days. We can put all of our processes on one and say, well, we can do an internal test on this, but when you're distributed, there's a very good chance that all those processes might end up running on different machines. And again, depending upon the control that you exert over your platform providers, they might even be in different data centers if you don't, specify. And what's going to happen between your services when latency goes up? Because we're used to testing them on single machines in our studios, and maybe single machines when we do limited deployments. But are you having your network people put every process on a different machine, force it onto a different machine, and see what latency between your backend servers is going to cost you? And sometimes that can expose some interesting race conditions.
Absolutely right. Yeah, testing in what I would say is like as close to a production-ready platform as early as possible as you can, so you find out all of these little nuances is really important.
Always, yes. I was just about to say that, indeed. One other thing that is interesting to do to prepare before launching, and as we said multiple times, there is nothing that can test your game better than the public. And this is why I'm a big fan of when we do alpha and closed beta and that kind of stuff, because it's like really a big help understanding what the public will be doing and what. But you're testing everything, but in a constrained environment with players that have limited expectation about the stability and the overall technical aspect and technical stability of your game. And I think this is really precious also to do.
Yeah, agreed. I particularly love it when studios do the very sort of early alphas, because of not only do you get to see things before
that sort of stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah, the test realms are great because they help the studio They help players understand what's coming. There's many different really good reasons to have them. But then you've also got the reverse of it, where you've got people data mining all of your content and then leaking it everywhere.
There's actually a really important kind of unit of work that needs to be done in terms of, as leaders, advocating to all the people at our studio how important public test realms and early network testing is, because you're right. Your designers in general will be against it because they've made a bunch of secret content that they want to trickle out at some particular rate. And when you come to them and say, we want to put up a server where everything is turned on and everybody can play all the stuff, and they're like, well, people are going to find out all the cool secrets we have coming. And the answer is that there's no good answer to that except shrugging and saying, that's the cost. If we trickle this out, then that we are releasing untested content. And if you're happy with that, that's great. But I think that there's a lot of corpses on the road from untested content, and it's really important to advocate to your leadership, to your design team, how important it is that their designs get tested by real people before you just flip the switch and your entire player base just dumps in there.
I think that's cost of quality is the way I would position that. Getting to the point of actually delivering a really quality experience. Sorry, Joe, I don't want to.
No, I was just I totally agree with Brian. It's like a tug of war when you're releasing something brand new. Marketing has one chance to make a first impression, and they don't want you to ruin that. And obviously, you have one chance to make a good impression, and you don't want to go out unprepared. So it's tricky, but definitely the limited public tests that we did, and we learned a ton from those. For sure, because even when we do we're always playtesting, but now with massive machines and you can fit 40 or 50 servers on it, we're never going to fill up a machine full of servers with the same game mode if we're just doing a studio-wide playtest. So yeah.
Actually, it's another sort of valid string to pull on there is not all games have a singular mode or a singular map. You have many different almost genres of games within a game now, especially in a live service or games as a service model. Is there anything around the technology choices that you would make that would change based on what those different game modes are within your wider game, as it were?
I think the biggest thing for us was just player count, because we can have 1v1 or 4v4, and we know we can pack a ton more 1v1 servers on a box. And definitely, I think within a few weeks of launch, we launched with 3v3, and even when we just went to, we had all eyes were on, and we were optimizing, and then it was one of those days where we looked at the graphs and we're like, what's wrong today? Why are people complaining for banding? We're like, oh, 4v4 went live.
Yeah, it makes a massive thing. And with the kind of battle royale genre as well, you've then got, hey, if you're spinning up essentially a dedicated game server for a party server, do those have a different usage profile to your match servers and your 1v1s and your 3v3s, which they obviously do, right? And there's I think different specifications you need to make for each of those kind of different things. It's quite a difficult thing to judge, I think, when you're constantly dynamically looking at all these different servers that have different resources and different usages, I think.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts or feelings around technology choices and during the development life cycle? I think collectively we've answered the question as early as possible, but I just wanted to make sure if anyone else had any other viewpoints. Nope. Silence is also, let's move on to the next question. So how has your development lifecycle changed to meet the needs and challenges of the game as a service model? I know we've covered that sort of tangentially during our conversation, but is there any other points that you guys want to bring into this sort of question?
As an old MMO guy, it's both exciting and horrifying to say that things haven't changed that much. The rest of the genres have caught up with MMOs, because we were always games as a service, right? Mm-hmm. It's always these massive networks of backend servers talking to each other, and connection servers connecting out to hundreds of thousands of people and all congregating stuff. And, in the last 10 years, that's come to almost every other genre now, right? A side-scrolling game still has a network connection and an ecosystem behind it. So yeah, not a lot has changed for me, but it's definitely changed for the industry.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, certainly the just massive influx of information that we get from our community managers is a thing that doesn't exist in the same way during development. Like during development, you have the team that are saying like, oh, we should change this, or whatever. But it's really different when, you know, a person with a specific brand of CPU, or, you know, a certain flavor of console in a certain country, you know, has an issue, and you're just never going to see those issues during development and during QA, and you have to make the space to pay attention to the reports that come in, because for one or two or however many people that are in your Discord telling you about it, there's obviously going to be more people out there that are not in your Discord that are seeing that. Other thing that we do is that so we have our client updates that are the executables that go through first party and that patch process. We also have like a lightweight sort of content update process, so we can, if there's a piece of content that we can tweak that's not the executable that can fix a bug, we'll do that when it's critical. So the game will check for those downloads on boot and can really fix some important issues for the end user. So paying attention to the influx of information, and then, you know, realizing that things are high priority enough to prepare a content update to do that before your next client patch.
Yeah, definitely. Like every time you design a new system that you put into your game, just think all the ways you can try to extract as many things as possible to give you control over what's like the behavior of the game without updating the executable, because the submission process we have to go through to release on console takes some time, especially now with the pandemic. Some first party are very even longer. So every time we can put something, some piece of logic on servers, some piece of configuration on servers, every time we can give us some extra power over maintaining the game and tweaking something on the fly, we do it, because this is just how important it is. It's a difference between releasing a fix for an issue to players in days versus weeks.
Would you say one of the main driving factors behind that is the certification process, to make sure that you can be adaptive based on being in a games as a service model? You're trying to keep content evergreen, you're trying to keep things updated. So without having to wait until the next scheduled like patch, having the ability to do remote config and things like that is truly important in this new model. Well, yeah. Not so new for Brian, but everyone else is getting into it.
The thing is, yeah, the submission process is really like a big thing in this, because it's very time consuming for us on Vigor to make. Well, it's like making the patch itself is quite easy. It just takes a night and it's built. But like verifying that the patch, testing it, and then sending it to first parties and waiting for their approval before we can release it, it's like really weeks before we can like have a fix and push it to players. Also, there is a hidden tax on that, because it means that we will have to pull out some developers from their current work to be working on that fix. So this is also like an additional thing, an additional factor. So if you have to do that, it's really time consuming. Whereas if you can just flip a number somewhere and it will just fix the issue, then that's for the best. We have had issues with some performances on some game modes when we launched them, and the fact that we could just say, okay, well, for this amount of players is not enough, it's too taxing, but we can lower the amount of players on that game mode and it will fix the performance issue, or at least the game mode will be much more enjoyable for players. So that was easy. And then we were able to look into that game mode, optimize it, release it, but that was the long process. But we could act on the issue really fast and implement a fix for the community so that the issue was resolved, and then we could like fix it properly and have time to just think about it and make it proper, not just rush a hot fix and just take the risk of missing something during the test phase and breaking even more the game.
Yeah.
Generally make everything as hot fixable as possible. And the differentiation between a hot fix, which is, you know, nobody gets disconnected and you made a change, and like a warm fix where you just have to change a backend service and reboot it, and making sure people understand at your studio what sort of changes would require a full client like patch, because oftentimes production and design won't really know what's going to trigger a client patch versus what can be done on the back end, and making sure that people understand when that's going to happen is going to help everyone, like, kind of schedule better and scope.
Yeah, so there's like an internal comms thing within the studio, right? In terms of the community managers know exactly what the impact of the change is. Yeah, amazing. So we talk a lot about fixes to the clients and that kind of stuff. How does that extend for content drops and season launches and that kind of stuff? Are these the kind of things you can do with these kind of back end toggles, or are they more in depth with client patches? Johan is laughing. He sounds like he's got a story.
Funny you're mentioning it. We released a hotfix today. Wednesday we are dropping a new season, and it's just a Boolean flip on a server.
Yes,
exactly. That's what we want. Like, we have the dev stream coming, and we will just release the season while the dev stream is on. That's just awesome moment for the community and the dev team. I'm sorry, that was it.
I was going to ask, how do people find it now, where there is obviously a constant thirst for new content? When you guys then create and launch that content, it has an impact on your infrastructure requirements, not just like in hosting, but across the board, across all of the different services and microservices that actually support a game. What considerations do you guys give to that in this game as a service model? Like, how do you expect to meet the demand of that scalability when you do drop that content?
I think from my perspective, it's the right amount of fear when you see backend code being changed. It's sort of like, because you're always looking at all the code reviews, and you're like, okay, I get it. And then when you see changes coming into the backend, you're like, okay, what's going on here? When is this going to land? It's going to be for the next season. Or you'll see something like I mentioned earlier about sort of shooting yourself in the foot with respect to like, oh yeah, you push the button in UI and then it sends a network request. This is the first time we've developed a game that has seasons and stuff like that. So we're like, you can see the code being written. That's like, when the time changes to this, do this thing. And it's like, hang on a second, every server that's online at the same time when that clock ticks over is going to do the same thing.
Yeah, one more challenge with game as a service is we had to face is that we had to integrate the community management team a lot more into the development process. Like, since Vigor was like developed for 2 or 3 years, I wasn't in the team back then. But then when we switched, like when we launched, and then we had to, start pushing updates regularly. That's something that at first was really difficult. There was a lot of hiccups, communication issues, like the team doing something and the players, the community management not knowing about it. And so this is one challenge we had, that we were not like keeping the community management team up to date enough. So we had to integrate them into every decisions we are making now. And it's like super smooth. Like, there is nothing that happens in the team that they don't know about. So it's really cool.
Would that also then would have changed your like CI/CD pipeline as well, around the tooling that you use to then actually message out to different teams to keep them all in sync? Or is that not something you would do through your development pipeline? Is there another process you'd go through? Like, just trying to get an understanding of how you would best practice this, as it were.
I guess it's simpler for us because, like the Vigor team is 20 people. So keeping up to date 20 people is quite easy. I don't know how it is for Apex or bigger games. Like with bigger teams, I guess it's much more challenging, but we are all sitting in the same office. So like the challenge is just like, let's meet in some office room and let's just make sure that everybody gets the information. So I'm not sure I can provide you much more interesting answer to that.
But Brian or Joe, have you had to modify any of your like pipeline tooling to accommodate the new, the game as a service model?
I'm trying to think about the biggest thing for us is just that everything can be faster. Like, whenever QA has to wait for a build, it's like, why does it take so long? Why does it take so long? And they're right, because shout out to QA. Obviously, they have one of the hardest jobs. All the things that they have to cover, and there's a balance between like, run all the automated tests and stuff like that. And no, I just need an artifact. I need the build so that I can run it and play it, because there's this very specific bug that I want to go and reproduce. And it's definitely become higher priority for us that we can just get built out as quickly as possible. And I'm not sure what other people's like where your barometer is, but like even if somebody has to wait 2 hours or something like that's just not fast enough. Yeah.
Brian, did you have something to add in on this as well?
Kind of beyond what I said, not a whole lot. Our at Psyonix currently we've been kind of a games as a service model from the beginning, and that's served us pretty well. The adaptations we've made have been mostly towards getting more things kind of hot fixable and like less client patches. It's an ongoing process though, especially because the game has been around for a while on the same engine. So there's a lot of new things coming, but everything we're planning out now is really like taking all the learning that we've had in terms of like having to patch repeatedly and try to make less of those full client patches necessary.
That's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments? This is our last question, so I just wanted to sort of say if there's nothing else in here, we could probably just have a chat for a bit about any other topics that are interesting for people. Brian, did you have something else? I saw the finger go up.
I guess like just in terms of general planning for multiplayer. One of the things that I think that almost every company can do is make sure that your engineering teams start to understand the power of shared memory on your servers, and how to basically use that and work with kind of your server providers. It's something that we're currently not doing at Psyonix because we haven't had to yet. We definitely had to do it on a lot of MMOs because you'd have multiple like world simulation processes, and the map was so huge you couldn't load your map into every process, or you could, but you'd only be able to get a few processes on your physical machine. And so being able to use shared memory, which means basically there's a lot of constraints about how your processes are going to access that memory and how they're going to kind of refer to it, is incredibly powerful. And I found that even today, a lot of development teams don't truly understand the intricacies of, for example, like how a particular Linux kernel is going to use shared memory. But understanding that stuff is like magic. Suddenly you can go from having like a few server processes to hundreds of server processes if your gating factor was memory footprint. And so especially you start binning things together. You were talking about the 1-on-1 versus 2-on-2, 3-on-3. If you start binning together your game sizes and your maps, you can end up saying, okay, this particular machine is only going to run 2-on-2 matches on this particular map. And suddenly a whole lot of stuff can go into shared memory, and you can just get this gigantic explosion of your capacity. And again, I think, if you're going forward, in 2021, the more people who understand how to use shared memory, the more powerful our industry is going to get with massive multiplayer abilities.
Yeah, 100% agree there, Brian. It's something that I've been researching myself actually over the last couple of months about the best ways of looking how we could adapt our platform to truly make the best use of that type of technology. It's going to be a game changer when it comes to efficiencies and just squeezing the maximum amount of like capacity out of a single piece of hardware. So yeah, I'm 100% aligned behind that, Brian. It was a pleasure chatting with you guys. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciated it.
Okay, thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate your time.